Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to view my video essay, Learning About Yokai with Video Games, Nioh 2 as a Cross-Cultural Learning Tool for Japanese Folklore. This video was originally put together in August 2022 for the RePlaying Japan 2022 conference, but is going to be available on my YouTube channel afterwards. So if you're viewing this for the conference, or if you're viewing on YouTube at a later date, thank you so much for coming along for the ride with me. I really appreciate you being here. My name is Ryan Scheiding. I am an incoming assistant professor of digital media with a specialization in game studies and games design at the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta. I encourage any questions or comments that you have on this video essay, either at the conference itself, through the YouTube comments section, or you can always find me on Twitter. My handle is @RyanScheiding. Without further ado, let's get started. In this video essay, I will argue that Nioh 2 is an effective cross-cultural teaching tool that can introduce players to yokai. However, before I get deeper into that argument, it is best to provide some background information and some definitions so that you can better understand my approach. Working from the definitions put forth by experts in the field of yokai, such as Komatsu Kazuhiko and Michael Dillon Foster, I understand yokai as the supernatural entities or mysterious creatures found within Japanese folklore. A further or deeper dive into the literature of the field would reveal many more nuanced and detailed definitions, but for my purposes today, I believe this simple definition is the best. Yokai have a long history in popular media in Japan, dating back to at least the 17th century in ukiyo-e woodblock prints, and also perhaps even before that as the root of folk tales. They've become almost ubiquitous in media and have frequently been altered, adapted, and updated in the centuries since that time. I believe any one of us, especially as game scholars, can think of a media property that has many monsters in it, and we could see those as being yokai-based. Pokemon is a great example of that. However, while this popularity is certainly welcome, it does also obscure the folkloric origins of yokai and can act as an obstacle for those that wish to learn about the traditional depictions of yokai. So since there are so many monsters within Japanese media, for the uninitiated it's very difficult to determine which ones have these larger historical origins and can be traced back centuries, and which ones were created relatively recently. It's not to say that either is superior to the other, it just makes it a little bit more difficult if you don't have that knowledge already. This video essay argues that Nioh 2 can be used as a teaching tool for learning about yokai because of the game's use of traditional depictions of yokai, its accessibility, and its general difficulty that requires the practice, study, and repetition by the player that can help them not only see these traditional depictions, but help them to internalize, grasp, and to better remember these yokai. My arguments regarding Nioh 2 as a teaching tool are grounded in established game theory, especially games as history literature. There are many theorists that argue how video games can teach history, and have ideas ranging from the historical possibility space, that's put forth by Kurt Squire, historioludicity, put forth by Adam Chapman, or the idea of games as modern myth, that's Capel and Elliott. Generally, what we can say is that video games teach us about the past through game-specific ways of teaching the past. Another way of saying this is that if games make arguments, they can make arguments about history. These depictions are not always accurate, but they do represent the past and can help players to learn about larger historical patterns. As an extension of this, there are other theorists that have written about Japanese folklore and how it has been depicted within video games to make arguments about Japan's past. Capcom's Okami of 2006 and Tecmo's Fatal Frame series, 2001 to present, have been focal points of this, and this can be found in the works of Hutchinson, Gonsalvo, and Pruitt. This essay capitalizes on these theoretical discourses to argue that Nioh 2 creates a distinctive representation of Japan's past that is infused with folkloric elements. While Nioh 2 does not depict an accurate historical past, it provides a folkloric lens that is valuable as a learning tool, especially for players with interest in yokai and mythology. Having introduced yokai and the scholarly literature that informs the argumentation of this video essay, it's now possible to talk a little bit more about Nioh 2. Nioh 2 is an action role-playing game developed by Team Ninja and Ko Shibusawa, both of which are studios at Tecmo Koei, and it was released in 2020. All of the gameplay footage and screenshots that you see today are taken from my own gameplay and are taken from the PlayStation 4 version of the game, which was published by Sony. The game retells the history of the Sengoku period, or the Warring States period, but blends folkloric elements into the story and gameplay. This is primarily accomplished through the inclusion of yokai. The game features a story where the player's created character interacts with well-known historical figures as they engage in the unification of Japan during the Warring States period. This prominently includes people such as Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who the player meets in the early parts of the story, but also has some humorous inclusions as well. For example, Matsunaga Hisahide, who becomes an appraiser of tea utensils for the player. Despite the inclusion of real historical figures and locations, the game is not historically accurate and is not meant to be so. In fact, the story is perhaps not even the main draw of the game. Instead, it is the action, gameplay, looting, and development of the player's character. The game is notoriously difficult, and it requires mastery on the part of the player to be completed, or to be even completed successfully, one would argue. However, this is considered a selling point of the game rather than as a negative. Nioh 2 falls very comfortably into the so-called Soulsborne style of gameplay, where the player is expected to fail, to die, and to come back again and again as they develop a mastery and try to become better at the game. This leads us to our major question. How can Nioh 2 be considered a cross-cultural yokai teaching tool? I believe that this boils down to three main factors. Firstly, many of the depictions of yokai in the game are based on traditional depictions rather than original creations. Secondly, the general difficulty of the game requires the player to study yokai, learn their traits, and repeat many fights in order to advance. On the screen right now, you'll see the illustrations Bestiary. And the inclusion of this illustrations bestiary is a brilliant combination of traditional yokai encyclopedias, which date back to the 17th century of Toriyama Seikian fame, and the video game staple of the bestiary. When a player is struggling in Nioh 2, they can go to this illustrations section to not only see a physical depiction of the yokai, but to read about its traits, some of its history or the way that that is depicted in the game and the lore, and to also learn so that they can try fights again and do better and improve their skills within Nioh 2. Thirdly and finally is the accessibility of the game. Now, in terms of accessibility, I want to be very specific as to what I mean with this. Nioh 2 is accessible as a teaching tool, a cross-cultural teaching tool for yokai, because it does not presuppose knowledge of yokai. It is available in many languages due to localization. It is easily acquired through digital storefronts, and it represents a much smaller financial investment than alternative methods of learning about yokai. For example, traveling to Japan, purchase of specialist monographs, seeking expert opinions, etc. Taken together then, Nioh 2 is easily accessed, depicts yokai in a historically significant way, and provides tools while forcing repetition, or what we could label as study. To better display the significance of the depiction of yokai and the importance of the difficulty of the gameplay, we can take case studies of specific yokai from Nioh 2. As our first case study, we can look at the Yamamba, which is sometimes referred to as the Mountain Witch in the English language translation of yokai material. The depiction from Nioh 2 mimics the depiction of the Yamamba from Toriyama Seikian's 18th century yokai encyclopedias, most prominently in depicting the yokai as looking like a very horrific elderly woman. This yokai is probably a reference to old women being abandoned in the mountains or a fear of the mountains in general. Interestingly, in Nioh 2, Yamamba frequently appear in mountain dwellings and in mountain settings, and will viciously attack a player who is not wary or will enter these dwellings without having their guard up. Thus, through the depiction, which is based on a centuries-long depiction of the Yamamba, and its connection to the mountains within the game, the player will learn not only what that traditional depiction is, but also make the very key connection that the Yamamba is connected to the mountain motif. This is a simple but effective example of how Nioh 2 teaches its players about traditional representations of yokai. As a second case study, we can look at the Mujina, which is a yokai that is based on a badger and is known for its transformation powers. As you can see, it does not look very similar to the examples provided. The Nioh 2 example looks different from these two examples, one of which is from Toriyama Seikian again, and the other is a 19th century ukiyo-e artist, Utagawa Kuniyoshi. Nioh 2 does not represent the Mujina to look exactly the same as they do in these pictures, but it does keep the badger motif and the ability to transform, which are the most important part of understanding this yokai. Within the gameplay of Nioh 2, the Mujina act as trick treasure chests that the player can overcome by mimicking a random gesture made by the Mujina. There are treasure chests throughout Nioh 2, but when you can find one that is, when you try to open it, a Mujina jumps out instead. If you mimic the gesture that they make, you will not get attacked by the Mujina, and you will earn treasure. The gameplay thus incentivizes learning about Mujina through its design and gameplay, just as the folktale teaches to beware the transforming badgers. Players learn to beware the treasure chests because they could potentially be these same yokai. Moving forward, we can see our third case study of the Teiso, which is based on a folktale where a monk returns as a rat to Earth after his death and eats temple parchment. The Teiso in Nioh 2 mimic the traditional portrayal, as shown in the examples here, once again Toriyama Seikian and another artist, Tsukioka Yoshitoshi. They're also frequently found in locations with books, including one particularly relevant fight in a temple library. As we saw with the Yamamba, the Teiso thus becomes another example of a very close physical depiction, but also one that teaches you the significance of the yokai and where it would be found through gameplay. The Teiso was connected to the eating of parchment in the folktale, and in Nioh 2, this is very much represented in the way that you fight and where you fight the Teiso. Next we have one of my personal favorite yokai from Nioh 2, the Ubume. The Ubume is a female yokai that either lost a child or died during childbirth and comes to the earth as this ghostly apparition that is holding the child. They sometimes offer travelers going by to hold the child, and then doom befalls them. The Nioh 2 depiction mimics the traditional depictions of this yokai, as seen through the Toriyama Seikian example, and this Edo-era scroll that is taken from the Yumoto Koichi Memorial Japan Yokai Museum. However, there's a twist. The child in the Nioh 2 version has been replaced by Amrita. Amrita are the spirit stones which the plot of Nioh 2 revolves around. This becomes important and it becomes an interesting gameplay mechanic, because this Amrita becomes the weak spot of the yokai rather than something more traditional like the head. This reinforces the elements of the original folklore, i.e. the importance of the child. And the player can either discover that this is the yokai's weak point through trial and error and through gameplay, or by reading about this through the illustration. This becomes a very nuanced example of how Nioh 2 incorporates folklore into traditional gameplay elements. Next we have the Kamaitachi, referred to and translated as the sickle weasel in many yokai works that are translated into English. The Kamaitachi appears in Nioh 2 very much as it does in Toriyama Seikian's encyclopedias from the 18th century. It is a frankly adorable weasel that attacks by spinning in the air with blades. Traditionally, the yokai was believed to be the cause of mysterious cuts and wounds that would appear on people, like that they didn't notice had happened. And this aspect of the folklore is mimicked in the way that the Kamaitachi attacks when, as a boss fight in Nioh 2. It jumps into the trees and spins through the air to cut at their enemy. It attacks with wind and blade-based attacks. So once again, we see an example of a yokai that is very much taken its physical characteristics taken out of traditional depictions, but then also important aspects that can help the person learn about yokai and traditional representations are enacted in the gameplay as well. I did, for our purposes, also take some slowed down, slow-mo footage of the Kamaitachi spinning with the attack, just so it could be a little bit more clear within the footage what it was that we were looking at. And as a final case study example, we have the Nioh, which is a formless walking blob type yokai. And as you can see, it is perhaps most closely resembles its 18th century counterparts, once again here taken from Toriyama Seikien's yokai encyclopedias, and an example from the Yumoto Koichi Museum. Interestingly, in terms of gameplay, this yokai is highly damage resistant, which helps to depict its formless nature. So since it is just this formless blob type, you can't just attack it as you normally would. And once again, it just reiterating the point, this is an example of taking a physical representation from traditional yokai depictions and some of the characteristics of that and putting that directly into the game for the player. All of the yokai that we have looked at today are thus traditionally depicted and have their traits reinforced through gameplay and game design. To conclude, Nioh 2 functions as a cross-cultural teaching tool for several reasons. Its depiction of yokai are based upon traditional sources. The game does not presuppose knowledge of yokai among its players. It is available in numerous languages due to localization, allowing players to learn about yokai in their native language. It is easily available through digital storefronts, and it is potentially less expensive than other avenues of learning about yokai. Also, the game requires practice and study by the player to successfully finish. I argue that through a combination of accessibility, traditional representation of yokai, and gameplay and game design mechanics that necessitate study and repetition, Nioh 2 provides its players with a wealth of information and tools to learn about yokai. In doing this, it subverts expectations of what an educational game is and where historical educational value can be found in the larger landscape of video games as a medium. I'd like to thank you very much for your time and your attention today. And following this last part here, there will be a references page with all of the works that I referred to, and contact information so that you can reach out to me. I do encourage you to interact with me through Twitter, at Ryan Scheiding. You can visit my website, ryanscheiding.ca. And you can also check out my itch.io page where I post the games that I make under the name of Tubba Games Manufacturing Concern. Thank you so much.